Welcome to another wonderful Grace Austen audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Regency romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Grace Austen, Regency romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Christmas and the Vicar's Daughter. Chapter 1. Early December, London 1815. What do you think you're doing? Esther Mullen stiffened at the familiar masculine voice speaking from behind her. She knew that deep baritone. Had she been recognized already? She'd scarcely stepped foot inside the door of the gentlemen's club. Surely, Lord Louis Barrington couldn't have seen through her disguise with such ease. Pivoting on her booted heels, she tried to brazen it out. "I'm sorry, my lord. Were you addressing me?" The man standing in front of her was tall and lean, turned out in the height of fashion, as befitted the heir to the Earl of Rostendham. Silky black curls framed his handsome face and a dimple winked in his left cheek despite his stern expression. Her heartbeat increased its pace at the sight of him, but she attempted to push her reaction to him from her mind, with only minimal success. According to the rules of the ton, Lord Louis Barrington was far above a lowly vicar's daughter. Good thing for Esther that she didn't care a jot about society's dictates. Louis was no better than her, or anyone else, simply because an accident of birth had blessed him with wealth, status, and a future title. A person's efforts were what one should find worthy of admiration, not whether they could lay claim to an aristocratic lineage. Lord Rostendham's son never had to worry about lack of funds. His allowance alone must be enough to feed half the poor in London. Instead, she knew for a fact that he spent thousands of pounds annually on frivolous pursuits, paying tailor's bills and buying a curricle and a matched set of greys to pull it. How could she be drawn to a man like that? Yet, she was. "How did you gain admittance to this club?" "Louis," Lord Barrington demanded. Esther wasn't yet ready to accept defeat. Perhaps she could still wriggle her way out of this. "You must have mistaken me for someone else, my good sir. I'm a member of this establishment." She'd used her cousin, Ross Whittingham's name to enter the gentlemen's club frequented by London's wealthy and titled. Cousin Ross wouldn't appreciate Esther impersonating him, but there was no need for him to know. Besides, this had been the only way she could think of to gain her aims. She'd been left with no other means to obtain the funds she required after all doors were slammed in her face. She tugged at the hem of the gold-embroidered waistcoat she wore beneath an oversized bottle-green coat of superfine, hoping she appeared suitably manly and unconcerned, as though she belonged in this masculine domain. "Please excuse me." She turned on her heel, intending to continue on to the card room, but a strong, gloved hand clamped down upon her lower arm, pulling her to a halt. Even with layers of cloth separating them, warmth spread across her skin from the point of contact. But she refused to let her response to his touch sidetrack her from her purpose. She spun back to face him once more and looked up into his forbidding winter-grey eyes. "Unhand me." He ignored her command. "Don't take me for a fool. We've known each other since we were children, Esther Mullins." "Sure." "Keep your voice down," she hissed, her eyes darting left and right, checking to determine if any of the nearby gentlemen had overheard him. Esther found that she and Louis were drawing more attention than was to her liking. He hadn't been taken in by her guise for 1 minute, drat it. But that was only due to their long acquaintance, surely. No one else present would recognize her? She hoped. Louis still hadn't loosened his grip on her wrist. Before she could offer any protest, he pulled her toward the front door. She tugged against his hold, but he refused to release her. Though he was gentle enough to ensure he caused her no physical harm, she couldn't break free from him without creating even more of a spectacle than they already had. And her efforts in coming here would not be helped by the general populace discovering her ruse. To say nothing of Papa's reaction if he learned what she was about when he allowed her to visit her godmother in London while her parents remained at the vicarage in Rostendham. Esther was forced to trail along behind Lord Barrington like a disobedient puppy as he escorted her from the club. They walked down the front steps and reached the cobbled street before he finally deigned to release her. She rubbed at the spot where his fingers had encircled her wrist, his touch seeming to linger as though burned into her skin. Yet she missed his nearness when he moved away from her, putting a respectable distance between them. She shivered as a sudden gust of chilly early December wind blew between the buildings. The sky overhead was grey, threatening more snow while a few white flurries drifted to the ground. "Did you hire a hackney to travel here?" Lewis glanced up and down the street, as though expecting to see a hired carriage waiting. "No, I walked from my godmother's rented house." She often resided with Mrs. Honora Peregrue for several weeks during the year when her father and mother opted to stay in the country. Papa didn't like to travel away from the vicarage for more than a few days at a stretch, and Esther needed to be in London to continue her charitable endeavours. "I'll see you home," Lewis offered, pulling the edges of his overcoat tight around his neck to guard against the cold. "Thank you, but that isn't necessary." "I insist." Chapter 2. Lord Lewis Barrington would hear no more arguments from Miss Mullins on the matter. It was the only way for him to ensure that she arrived at her godmother's house without any disastrous detours. "My curricle is just over there." He waved Esther ahead of him. Fortunately, he'd chosen to drive the small vehicle, despite the inclement weather. It wouldn't be proper for him to ride alone in an enclosed coach with an unattached young woman of marriageable age. And in case anyone should see through her outlandish disguise, he preferred not to risk a scandal. It was bad enough that the ton would be rife with gossip if she were recognized while gallivanting around dressed up as a male. Esther hesitated for a moment, her full pink lips pulled into a mutinous line. "Fine," she huffed and stomped across the street toward his carriage in her borrowed boots. He resisted the urge to help her into the high-perch vehicle, knowing such action would only lead to raised eyebrows and speculation, given Esther's current attire. She had no difficulty climbing up onto the seat on her own, without the hindrance of skirts. His eyes were drawn to the material pulled taut across her rear, affording him an unexpectedly luscious view of her curves. His attraction to her wasn't diminished by her prickly attitude or her masculine clothing. Just the opposite, in fact. He felt decidedly overwarm, in spite of the chill in the air. Barrington pulled his gaze away from Esther's delectable person and hooked a finger under his suddenly too tight cravat. He cleared his throat as he rounded the curricle to the driver's side. Once he gained his seat, he flicked the reins and his matched pair of grey set off. He tried, and failed, to ignore the press of her leg against his own on the narrow seat. Esther's golden hair was tucked under a hat, but wispy curls had escaped at her temples. His fingers itched to touch the strands and find out if they were as silky as they appeared. He tightened his hands around the reins instead, resisting the impulse. He and Esther had played together in the country as children, though she was 5 years younger. Then he had been sent away to school, and he hadn't seen her again for years. When he'd returned, his childhood playmate had turned into a beautiful woman. But the lovely English Rose had a prickly nature and a cutting tongue that she turned on anyone unfortunate enough to incur her displeasure. She had no liking for the arbitrary rules of the ton, and she was rather too blunt when expressing her opinions about the evils that lurked in society. Esther had been evasive earlier in the club, but now that she was away from curious eavesdroppers and need not concern herself with being overheard, he expected answers from her. "What were you doing in a gentleman's club, dressed in a man's waistcoat and breeches?" he questioned. "I don't owe you explanations. You are not my father." "And what would your father have to say about this?" he challenged. Her mouth clamped shut, and she refused to reply. Which gave him a fair idea of what her father's reaction would be. "What compelled you to put yourself in such a precarious position? Just think of what might have happened to you if I hadn't stepped in. My time could be better spent on other endeavors. Yet, somehow I find myself here, pulling you out of situations of your own making," he rebuked, hoping to prod her into revealing her intent. She stuck her chin in the air, her stubbornness coming to the fore. "No one asked you to interfere. That's a fine thanks I get for coming to your rescue." Her cheeks flushed with indignation as her hands fisted at her sides. "I did not require rescuing." "Well, that's open to debate. I don't imagine that Vicar Mullins would agree with you. Leave my father out of this. Then, tell me why you were at the club," he bargained. "First I'll have your word that you won't tell my father about today. I don't believe it would be to your benefit for me to keep silent on this matter." He held up a hand to forestall her from interrupting, as she clearly intended. "Nonetheless, I give you my word of honor as a gentleman." no matter that it was against his better judgment. She made a rude sound in response, but finally relented. "If you must know, I'm rather good at card games, and I had plans to turn my pin money into enough capital to fund my charitable works, since I failed to obtain sufficient donations from those in a position to aid the less fortunate." She didn't add the words, "such as yourself," but the inference was heavy in her tone. He should have guessed that whatever her scheme, it would somehow involve her efforts to help the poor of London. It seemed as though Esther was determined to save every soul in town, single-handedly, if need be. Her father was a good man who gave generously of his time to serve others. But he wasn't a rich man. A vicar's living didn't provide an overabundance of funds to support his daughter's continual projects. Thus, Esther had taken matters into her own hands. Barrington admired her courage and convictions, but her methods left much to be desired. It was this which he found fault with. He sighed heavily. His father, the Earl of Rostendham, would never approve of a match between them, would never countenance his son courting Esther, or accept her as a suitable future countess. Not when she flaunted her utter disregard for the peerage. But every time Barrington attempted to offer gentle hints or guidance to temper her behavior, she stormed away in a huff. Yet, he felt compelled to try reasoning with her once more. At least she couldn't escape while the carriage was in motion. "You risked losing what little money you have by gambling it all on the turn of a card. I would have won. So says every incautious man who enters a gentleman's club, gaming hall, or tavern. I do not need a lecture from you on the hazards of gambling." Her blue-green eyes flashed, sparkling with temper, and she turned her head away from him. Chapter 3. Barrington remained silent for several minutes as the carriage travelled through the busy streets of London. Finally, he could tolerate the uncomfortable silence no longer, and he broke it by introducing a more neutral topic that he hoped would prove less likely to raise her ire. "The day after tomorrow, I'll be returning to my father's country seat in Rostendham for the Christmas season. Might I see you there?" She didn't respond for a moment, still holding onto her piquet, but then she turned back to face him. "I must continue my work here. The needs of the poor are even greater during the bitter cold of winter when they lack adequate shelter, clothing, and food. Families with no coal, children without shoes." Her mouth pulled down in a frown and her eyebrows knit together. Clearly, the thought of all their suffering distressed her greatly. "However, my father and mother wish for me to spend Christmas in the country with them. I shall travel to Rostendham a few days beforehand and stay for a se'night only." Although her aims were noble, he shuddered to imagine what trouble she might get up to here in London in the meantime, with only her godmother to keep her from mischief and catastrophe. The widow of a well-to-do merchant, Mrs. Peregrine allowed Esther to do as she pleased. He was surprised her father, the vicar, had let the arrangement stand, since the older woman did little to rein in her goddaughter. Barrington pulled back on the traces, drawing his horses and carriage to a stop, and let Esther down at the steps of her godmother's townhouse. "Good day to you, Lord Barrington," she said in parting. "And to you," he returned. She nodded once and spun on her heels. He watched until she disappeared inside the house, with the black lacquered door shut firmly behind her. He gave a command and the horses started forward once more, but Barrington's thoughts remained on Esther. She had gone too far this time. Her previous behavior hadn't made her any friends, but neither had it caused her any true harm. Today, she had crossed a line and courted disaster. If her ruse were discovered, it wouldn't just give rise to talk or have people seeking to avoid her and her blunt criticisms on their moral obligations. Her actions could have led to scandal and her utter ruin. But Barrington had given his word, and he would not go back on it. He wouldn't inform her father of this day's events, though he hoped the older man learned of it. The vicar needed to take Esther in hand and put a halt to her wilder adventures before something truly regrettable occurred. What was to keep Esther from trying the same trick and attempting to sneak into the club again, on another day? The very moment that Barrington's back was turned, in fact. He resisted the urge to look over his shoulder, and he feared the answer to his own question was nothing. Only next time, he might not be around to pull her out of danger and save her from herself. A week later, Esther's father arrived unexpectedly in London, and she returned to her godmother's townhouse mid-morning to find him waiting for her in the front parlour. "Papa, what are you doing here? Why didn't you send word that you were coming?" He had been insistent that he would retrieve her from London at the agreed-upon time, rather than allowing her to take the mail coach alone in the company of her godmother's maid. All this no doubt to ensure that Esther returned home as instructed. But he wasn't supposed to collect her for another fortnight. She glanced around the room. "Is Mama with you?" "No, Esther. I'm here because I've learned some distressing news." For the first time, she noticed that his thinning brown hair stood up in spikes, as though he had been at his wit's end, a clear sign of his agitation. "Has Mama taken ill?" A sharp pain stabbed her heart at the thought. "Your mother is as hale as always," he assured her, but Esther's feeling of relief was short-lived as he continued. "This concerns you, daughter." "Me?" Only one possibility occurred to her in that moment. Had Louis broken his promise and gone running straight to her father with his account? She didn't want to believe it of him. But no matter. She wouldn't incriminate herself until she knew precisely what her father was speaking of and whether she had true cause for concern. "Whatever do you mean, Papa?" Squire Quinn arrived in Rostendham with a most troubling tale. She wondered if her father's friend had been at the club that day. She hadn't noticed him there, but most of her attention had been focused on Louis at the time. Perhaps Squire Quinn had heard the tale from someone else? Regardless, Louis clearly wasn't the only one who had seen through her disguise. The vicar's dark eyebrows lowered over his disapproving, icy blue stare. "You were seen entering a gentleman's club while dressed in waistcoat and breeches. I expect an accounting from you of your actions. What do you have to say for yourself, daughter?" "I'm sorry, Papa. I needed to win funds for my work with." He held up a hand, stopping the flow of her words. "As I suspected. You will return to the country with me immediately. But the people here need my aid. You will cease this foolishness at once." Foolishness? She was helping the less fortunate. It wasn't a trivial matter, such as the social entertainments and fashions with which most ladies of the ton occupied themselves. How could charity be foolishness, especially to a man of the church? "While I admire your giving spirit and desire to be of service to others, I can no longer allow you to go your own way, since it results in you making rash decisions which lead to unacceptable behavior. It has become utterly apparent that you cannot be left to stay in London in the absence of your mother and me, without getting into mischief. Your godmother can't be trusted to have charge of you, as it's been proven to me that she's an appallingly lax chaperone." "But—" He cut her off before she could voice any protests. "You will help your mother in Rostendham. Furthermore, you shall not be allowed to gad about on your own again until such time as you have shown me you can be trusted to make wise decisions that do not bring dishonor and shame. Now, go and pack your bags." His face had turned red with his heated emotions. She had never seen her papa in such a state, and she didn't know quite how to handle him in order to change his mind. He was usually the most tolerant and patient of fathers. Oh, if only he had simply sent a missive, she could have pretended she never received it. But perhaps that was the reason her father had come himself. He knew her stubborn nature and that a letter could be easily ignored. Though she wanted to argue, she headed reluctantly up the stairs to her bedroom to do as he'd ordered, giving in with ill grace. In short order, they were seated in a carriage and leaving the crowded streets of London behind. The grey, stormy weather seemed to match her mood exactly. Then, a heavy downpour began to fall, turning the coaching roads into a treacherous quagmire that slowed their progress. The journey to Rostendham took the better part of 2 days, riding in the mail coach, jostled by every bump in the road, while squeezed between her father and a matron with her lap dog. Despite the drizzle of rain that continued to fall, Esther was glad of the opportunity to get out at a posting inn and stretch her legs midway through the first day. Her father stayed silent as they travelled. Whether due to his wish not to air their grievances in public, or because he'd said all he intended to on the subject while they were still in London, Esther could not say. Chapter 4. It rained the whole of the first day, and through the night when they stopped at a coaching inn along the route. It hadn't let up as they started out the next morning. The sun finally put in an appearance, peeking from behind the clouds as they neared the village of Rostendham. Esther glanced out the window at the thatched roof fieldstone cottages that came into view. The coach passed by the blacksmith's shop and a dressmaker and the old stone church where her father held services and addressed the parishioners each Sunday. The quiet village was a marked, though not unwelcome, contrast to the frantic activity of London, with its crowds of carriages and horses clogging the streets, and everyone trying to get somewhere else. Here, the air was crisp and clean, not blackened by a thick haze of coal smoke hanging low over the populace. There was room to draw a full breath, surrounded by fields and forests. The mail coach swayed as it pulled into the inn yard and came to a halt in front of the Iron Hammer Inn and Tavern. The coachman climbed to the top of the carriage to retrieve their luggage from the roof and tossed it down to the ground. Once Esther alighted from the carriage, her father drew her aside. "The innkeeper will see that our bags are sent on to the vicarage. I have a matter to attend to before I return home." He gave her a stern look. "However, you are to go straight there, is that understood?" "Yes, Papa." "Inform your mother that I shall arrive home shortly." Without waiting for a reply from Esther, he turned from her and walked into the inn. Avoiding the scattered puddles in the inn yard, she gingerly made her way to the road and headed toward the vicarage. Though she was displeased to have been forced from her work in London, she felt undeniably cheered at the possibility of encountering Lewis again. She was loath to admit it, however. As if her thoughts had caused him to appear, she caught sight of Lewis coming out of a nearby shop. Her heart grew lighter as he paused upon spotting her, and then changed direction to meet her. "Miss Mullins." He reached for her hand and bowed over it, a wide smile curving his mouth. "This is indeed a pleasant surprise." "Good afternoon, Lord Barrington," she greeted him in return. His words and the fleeting touch of his gloved fingers against hers filled her with pleasure, no matter that she wished to deny his effect on her. She hastily pulled her hand away. "Please excuse me, but I must get home. I shall walk with you for a time, if you have no objection." He fell into step beside her without waiting for a response. It would be beyond the pale to reject his overture and demand he take himself off. Not that she normally cared a whit about the rules of propriety, but her father was still out of sorts over her recent behavior, and she didn't wish to give him more cause for anger. Esther intended to return to London just as soon as she was able. But she required time to convince her father. He would never agree to allow her to go before the holidays. Thus, she must resign herself to remaining here in the country for several weeks, at least. The earliest she could hope to take up her work once more was sometime at the beginning of the new year. But come January, that was her aim. While she remained silent, Lewis kept pace with her along the muddy lane, his hands clasped behind his back. "I didn't think to see you here in Rostendam for some weeks yet," he remarked. "Papa insisted I return home at once. After he learned of my visit to the gentlemen's club," she admitted with no small amount of reluctance, not wishing to go into any further detail. Strong emotion pulled his features taut. "Your father did not hear of it from me." Did Lewis imagine she was pointing a finger at him in accusation? "I know you aren't responsible for this unfortunate turn of events." Squire Quinn carried the tale to his ears. "The meddlesome, old curmudgeon." "I'm sorry that your plans didn't turn out as you'd hoped, Miss Mullins," Barrington replied. "But I'm delighted to have you here." Clearly, he was the only one of them who felt that way, however. Though Esther might be upset by the current state of affairs, Barrington couldn't help but view this in a positive light, as a good and necessary thing. His relief was great that she would be safe from further calamities of her own making, at last. Nonetheless, a change of subject seemed in order. "My mother has planned a Christmas house party and has invited several families. They'll be descending on Elmwood Hall within the week." She tipped her face up toward him, and the wind caused tendrils of her blonde hair to dance across her cheeks. A few strands caught at the corner of her lips before she brushed them away. "You don't appear particularly overjoyed at the prospect." "No, I'm not looking forward to the next fortnight," he acknowledged. "The Earl has determined that it's time I marry, and that I must begin the search for a wife without delay. To that end, Mother has made out a guest list which includes several eligible young ladies of good family, whom she has deemed would make a suitable future countess." Esther's blue-green gaze fell away from his. "It seems neither of us can escape from our parents' expectations during this holiday season." "So, it would appear." They reached the two-story stone cottage that served as the vicarage. Ivy climbed up the walls and around the windows, giving the cottage a fairy tale quality even in the dead of winter. Esther paused at the front door. "Thank you for seeing me home." "It was my pleasure, I assure you." He bowed over her hand once more, enjoying the moment of contact, however brief. The warmth of her hand seeped through the thin fabric of their gloves to reach his skin, lingering as he took his leave. He glanced back once and saw her looking after him. Upon realizing that she'd been caught, she pivoted and entered the house. A moment later, the door was closed behind her. Barrington turned to face forward again, a wide smile stretching his lips. He began to whistle as he walked away, heading back through the village to the stables where he'd left his horse. Chapter 5. Esther set another crooked stitch in the seam of a woolen stocking and let out a rude noise of frustration and weariness. She had always found needlework tedious beyond bearing. As a young girl, she'd grasped onto any excuse to escape outdoors, and her skill with a needle had suffered as a result. "Must you make that sound?" her mother asked. "I am aware that you wish for nothing more than to return to London with all possible haste, Esther. But there are worthy charitable endeavours here in Rostendam as well." Esther paused with the needle poking halfway through the woolen fabric. "No matter that Papa is displeased with my recent efforts to fund social reform, and has decreed that I must stay here at the vicarage, I will not abandon my purpose." The truly destitute in London needed her aid urgently, yet her mother had insisted that Esther help with stitching stockings and planning a celebration for the villagers to provide them with Christmas cheer. Though to Esther's mind, it seemed little better than the social engagements which were of such useless import to the aristocracy. Esther suspected that the older woman simply wished to keep her occupied, so as to ensure she stayed out of mischief while she was forced to remain in the country. The housemaid appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, forestalling further conversation on the subject. She moved forward to deliver a calling card to Esther's mother. The older woman silently read the name printed on the cream vellum, the corners of her mouth turning up in reaction. "Lord Barrington has come to call on us," she announced before addressing the maid. "Show him in, please, Mary." A moment later, Lewis entered the room, his black curls windblown, indicating he'd ridden his horse across the countryside from the Earl's estate. He was dressed in buff breeches and Hessian boots, a blue coat over his silver waistcoat and snowy white neckcloth, with gloves covering his strong hands. It had been several days since her encounter with Lewis that day in the village, upon her return to Rostendam. She'd been taken by surprise at how strongly she had reacted to hearing that he must search for a wife. She found she greatly disliked the thought of him marrying any one of the unknown ladies who were to be the guests of Lord and Lady Rostendam. But Esther didn't desire Lewis for herself. Did she? She hastily pushed away her uncertainty. It could never come to pass, even were she to wish it. A future earl would never marry a vicar's daughter. Lewis would be expected to make an advantageous match to secure a wife equal to him in both wealth and station. Doubtlessly, the young ladies invited to the earl's house party would be deemed much more suitable matches for him according to the rules of the ton. Though Esther had no regard for arbitrary societal constraints, they mattered a great deal to members of the peerage, such as Lewis and his family. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Mullins, Miss Mullins," he greeted, bowing to each one of them in turn. "Lord Barrington, how kind of you to call on us," her mother remarked. Esther was glad to have an excuse to set aside her needlework and stuffed the unfinished stocking into the sewing basket in a most haphazard fashion. Lewis took a seat at Esther's side on the settee, maintaining a respectable distance between them. Though his nearness affected her still. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Lord Barrington," Esther replied with rather more enthusiasm than she might have had he not given her a welcome reprieve. Her mother poured tea into a cup and offered it to Lewis. "We were stitching woolen stocking to give to the villagers for Christmas. Esther shall be helping me with organizing food for the celebration as well." He accepted the teacup from the older woman, the dainty flower-bedecked porcelain appearing absurdly small in his masculine hand. "You are to be commended for your charity, Mrs. Mullins." "Thank you, my lord." "And you, as well, Miss Mullins." Esther shrugged off his praise. "I shall certainly be kept busy," she allowed. "For I won't neglect my efforts in London. I must try to find a way to continue my work from here. Perhaps by writing letters," she mused, though those could be easily ignored. Or, she trailed off, unable to think of any other alternatives. "You might seek out patrons here in Rostendam for your causes in London," Lewis suggested. Esther considered that. There were only a handful of families with significant wealth in the district, but he was correct that she should make an attempt to approach them for funds to aid in her efforts. She wouldn't turn down any funds offered, no matter the source. I have heard that the Earl's and Countess's guests have already arrived at Elmwood Hall. Is that not true? Her mother queried Lewis as she served tea to Esther. You are correct. Esther took a sip of tea, then placed her cup and saucer on the table in front of her. Then should you not be entertaining them? Esther, her mother scolded, her expression censorious. One does not ask one's guest such impertinent questions. It's quite all right, Mrs. Mullins, Lewis assured, then turned his gaze toward Esther. You found me out, Miss Mullins. I freely confess I fled the uproar at Elmwood Hall in search of more amenable company. Her eyebrows arched in skepticism. Since when did he consider her agreeable company? More often than not, their exchanges seemed to end in argument. Lewis heaved a weary sigh. In truth, I'm only seeking to avoid two of the guests staying with us. One particularly persistent marriage-minded miss and her matchmaking mamma. You admit to hiding from two harmless females. Esther raised her eyebrows in question. I'm as brave as the next man, but I'm not witless. A wise man knows when to retreat from the field of battle. I have no doubt Mrs. Quinn and her daughter could cause even the most stalwart general in Wellington's army to declare surrender. Esther had no liking for Mrs. Quinn or her older daughter, Catherine. Yet, had the Countess of Rostendham judged Catherine Quinn a suitable wife for her son? Esther's estimation of Lewis's mother took a decided downturn. Catherine Quinn claimed a connection to the former Duke of Haviland, however, that failed to outweigh the fact that she was possessed of a truly unpleasant disposition. Any number of other young misses would be a much better choice of wife, to Esther's mind, although perhaps not so high in station as a duke's great-granddaughter. Please send our regards to Lord and Lady Rostendham, Esther's mother interjected, steering the conversation away from Lewis's avowed denial of cowardice. Lewis selected a tea cake from the plate her mother held out before him. My mother wished for me to convey an invitation to you and the Vicar, and Miss Mullins, too, of course, requesting that you join us at a dinner party at Elmwood Hall that she has planned for the day after next. You shall receive a formal invitation shortly. How kind of Lady Rostendham to include us. You must give her our thanks. I hope you will come. Though the comment was addressed to her mother, Lewis's gaze rested on Esther. It was the older woman who replied. We shall be pleased to accept. Esther didn't want to admit to herself, nor reveal to Lewis or her mother, how thrilled she was at receiving the invitation to Elmwood Hall, that she was to be a guest at a dinner party hosted by the Earl and Countess of Rostendham. There was a noise at the door just then. Yes, Mary, what is it? Esther's mother queried when she took notice of the maid standing in the doorway to the sitting room once more. Mrs. Rowena Linwood Quinn, Miss Catherine Linwood Quinn, and Miss Charlotte Linwood Quinn to see you, Mrs. Mullins. Chapter 6. There was a commotion in the hall as Mrs. Quinn and her eldest daughter barely waited for Mary to step aside before they charged into the room. Shy 15-year-old Charlotte followed at a much more sedate pace behind her mother and sister. They were merely plain, old, ordinary Quinns, but Mrs. Quinn insisted on attaching the Linwood name to hers so that all would know she was the granddaughter of a duke. Lewis stood at their arrival, as gentlemanly manners dictated. Mrs. Mullins, I hope you'll pardon the intrusion, Squire Quinn's wife trilled, a falsely sincere expression on her face. Oh, Lord Barrington, she gasped in feigned surprise, laying an overly dramatic hand against her ample chest. What good fortune to find you here. We didn't expect it. Did we, girls? No, Mamma, Catherine responded. Her younger sister kept her eyes downcast, her expression pinched. Esther strongly suspected that Mrs. Quinn and her daughters had followed Lewis there, much to poor Charlotte's discomfiture. Although Squire Quinn was a close friend of Papa's, Esther's mother merely tolerated his wife. And Mrs. Quinn certainly didn't seek out Mamma during the normal course of things. Esther turned her gaze to Lewis, and the expression on his face, it looked as though he'd swallowed something particularly loathsome. His eyes widened and his mouth puckered up. But he smoothed his features when he noticed he was the focus of several pairs of eyes. Once the Quinn sat down, Lewis resumed his seat. Esther's mother addressed the maid before she departed. Mary, please fetch more tea cakes and a fresh pot of tea from cook. Yes, Mrs. Mullins. She bobbed a curtsy and exited the parlour, returning a short time later with a tray of Cook's special cakes. "Lord Barrington, Elmwood Hall is so tastefully appointed," Catherine remarked. "Mamma and I were discussing it just this morning. The Countess is to be commended." She turned to address her mother. "We must ask Lady Rostendham for the name of her draper, Mamma." "Of course." She patted her daughter's hand as if the girl were exceedingly clever for making such a suggestion. "My Catherine would make an exceptional mistress of a grand estate such as Elmwood Hall. Her father has given her free rein to redecorate one of the guest chambers at Champton House, from the furnishings and draperies to the paper on the wall. And when the hand carvings on the new chairs weren't as she'd ordered, she insisted the carpenters do the work over again until they completed it to her satisfaction. One must be firm when dealing with tradespeople to ensure that they don't try to take advantage. Don't you agree, my lord?" Lewis made a noncommittal sound in response. Then the talk turned to Lord and Lady Rostendham's upcoming Christmas ball. "I had a new gown made especially for the occasion," Catherine remarked, though she was likely the only one in the room who truly cared about the subject, apart from her adoring mamma. A marvellous mauve velvet with a gold net overlay, designed by the most sought-after modiste in London. Esther nibbled on a tea cake as she struggled to remain silent while Catherine Quinn prattled on about her last visit to the dressmakers. "Madame Du Bois says I have a wonderful eye for fashion. The ball gown was designed to my specific requirements. I requested she add 12 additional bows to the skirt." She preened in satisfaction. Esther scoffed silently. That modiste was telling the foolish girl blatant falsehoods. Catherine seemed to favor pale lavender and gold, but the colors didn't suit her, lending a sallow cast to her complexion. Folding her hands in her lap, Esther fidgeted on the settee. If she had to sit there and listen to one more minute of gossip about fashions and other useless things, she might do something drastic. She broke into the conversation, interrupting this silly talk of gowns and fripperies. "Those who have so much would do well to help the less fortunate in London. One could feed a dozen families for the cost of the fabric used to stitch a single dress from a London modiste." "Not that dress, I'm sure," Catherine said, indicating the simple wool gown Esther wore. "The dressmaker in Rostendham is adequate for a vicar's daughter, but the Linwood Quinns have always had all their gowns made by Madame Du Bois." Esther's eyes narrowed in response to the other girl's patronizing words and superior tone. Barrington winced as Esther's blunt statement elicited a rather venomous attack from Miss Quinn. Her face twisted into an unattractive look of disdain. "If I'm not mistaken, that dress is several seasons past the current fashion, is it not, Miss Mullins?" Esther was dressed in a merino wool gown the exact blue-green shade of her eyes. An ivory cameo hung from a ribbon tied around her neck. Her blonde hair was pinned in a simple knot at the back of her head, with tendrils escaping to frame her face. "I think Miss Mullins looks lovely," Barrington interposed. "That color becomes her." Esther's eyes widened in surprise at his remarks, while Miss Quinn's expression soured. "You are too kind, my lord," Mrs. Quinn cut in, as though kindness alone was the only reason he would pay a compliment to Esther. Barrington felt relief when the clock on the mantel chimed the hour, indicating that the requisite quarter hour, the expected length of time for an afternoon social call, had passed. Though he wished to spend more time in Esther's company, Mrs. Quinn and Miss Catherine Quinn's overbearing presence had spoiled the occasion. He rose to his feet. "I must take my leave." Mrs. Quinn popped up from the delicate Windsor chair like a demented jack-in-the-box. "Oh, we shall join you, my lord. We're ready to depart as well, aren't we, girls?" Barrington cut in before the elder Miss Quinn could parrot agreement. "I apologize most sincerely, Mrs. Quinn, but that won't be possible. I have a matter of estate business I must see to before returning to Elmwood Hall." He bowed to each of the females in turn and quit the room before he gained any unwelcome hangers-on. He was only sorry he'd been forced to leave Esther so abruptly. But that day, he would have grasped at any excuse to escape his house party for a time, despite the weight of his parents' expectations to determine if any of the unattached young ladies in attendance would make a suitable wife. Truly, he had no interest in any of them. The only woman to capture his attention was Esther. Her lively spirit drew him. He even enjoyed it when they crossed words. He'd felt compelled to seek her out today, to see her again, even knowing he wasn't free to court her. Chapter 7. We've received our invitation to Lord and Lady Rostendom's dinner party, just as Lord Barrington promised, Esther's mother announced later that afternoon. I shall send our acceptance at once. Over the course of the next day and a half, Esther dithered over what gown to wear and how to arrange her hair, knowing that she would be in company with Lewis. She eventually settled on a gown of green velvet with cream lace at the cuffs and collar. The time it took to get ready seemed endless, as she sat fidgeting while the maid styled her hair in a complicated twist with several curls left loose to frame her face. "Are you almost finished?" Esther questioned when her patience deserted her. "Yes, miss." Esther sighed and tried to remain still while the task was completed. Her toilette took less than a quarter hour on most days, and she grew cross with herself that she was allowing thoughts of her appearance to matter so much on this particular occasion, behaving like a brainless ninny with nothing more significant in her head than fretting over preparation for her first season. She had thought herself above such things. It was rather lowering to discover she was not. But Esther plainly could not escape all traces of feminine vanity. And all because Lewis would be in attendance. A man who likely spent more than an hour on any given day causing his valet fits while putting himself together before heading out on his merry way without a care for those less fortunate. She didn't wish to concern herself with what he thought of her. Yet, she did. Her mind should be occupied with matters of worth. With that at the forefront of her mind, she determined that she would spend the formal dinner engaged in convincing the attendants of the need to support her causes. Yes, that was an acceptable reason to anticipate the coming evening. A short time later, she and her parents arrived at Elmwood Hall, the Earl of Rostendom's country estate. An oyster-shell drive curved in front of the Georgian manor house constructed of golden-colored stones. Mullioned windows lined the two wings that connected to the central structure, the leaded glass sparkling in the lantern light illuminating the entrance. A grand staircase led to the tall and imposing wooden front doors. Beyond the house and the formal gardens at the back, edged with boxwood hedges, an expanse of manicured winter-browned lawn sloped down to a large ornamental pond that would freeze over in a few weeks. A copse of leafless trees rimmed the far side of the lake, their skeletal branches reaching toward the sky. Inside, the formal entrance hall was just as impressive as the exterior facade. Esther hadn't set foot over the threshold of Elmwood Hall since she'd played here as a young child. Not much had changed, though she now realized the value of all the costly antiques filling the space. Recalling an ornamental vase that had been broken by their games, she couldn't ignore a sharp stab of remorse at their carelessness. Esther trailed behind her parents and Lord Rostendom's butler, Vicar and Mrs. Samuel Mullins. Miss Esther Mullins, the servant, announced them. When they stepped into the front parlor, Esther's gaze sought out Lewis without conscious volition. He smiled at her from across the room and seemed quite taken with her appearance. His grey eyes lit up like bright stars in the sky, filling her with a warm glow. Her lips began to curl upward in response before she caught herself and sternly reminded her brain that she wasn't supposed to care about his opinion of her. Still, her gaze was drawn to him again and again, surrounded by a group of unattached young ladies of marriageable age. She tried to convince herself the sight didn't affect her, but in fact, it affected her more than she liked to admit. It came as a relief to Esther when the butler re-entered the parlor and called the assembled guests to dinner. She found herself at the long, inlaid walnut dining table, seated between Squire Quin on one side and a young dandy on the other. Lewis was situated a few chairs down and across the table from Esther, with Catherine Quin to his right and another matrimonial prospect on his left. Clearly, Lady Rostendom was determined to give her son every opportunity to find a wife. Not that it mattered to Esther, she assured herself yet again. Nonetheless, throughout the first course, she glanced up at Lewis and discovered him watching her on more than one occasion. Each time their eyes met, she hastily lowered her gaze. It wasn't until the footman had removed the soup dishes and served the next course that Esther found an opening in the conversation to address her purpose and put forth her opinions on the need for a more socially conscious upper class. Squire Quin had just recounted the vast sum on money he'd lost on a foolish wager at the Iron Hammer Tavern the previous night. Esther could hold her tongue no longer. She patted the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. You gamble away more in one evening than most mine laborers and factory workers earn in a year. There are many more worthy causes that you would be better served to give your money. I would happily provide you with a list, if need be. The older man's round face began to turn purple with rage. Now see here. It's my blunt to do with as I see fit, I don't need an uppity chit who imagines herself far above her station to tell me how to spend it. What have those common men ever done for me, I ask you? Except expect handouts from their betters. Much like you are now. Esther forced herself to ignore the insults directed at her and focused on the more important matter at hand. You have been blessed with an abundance and should share in your good fortune, as a truly great man would. To not do so shows a marked lacking in one's person. Chapter 8. Barrington winced at the sharp criticism and, unsurprisingly, Squire Quin did not take kindly to Esther's remarks. The older man turned away from her to face the widowed baroness seated on his other side and engaged her in conversation. Barrington recognized it as a blatant snub to Esther, but she didn't allow it to deter her. She next shifted her focus to the man sitting on her right, but he seemed to be keeping his back to her deliberately. A dandy dressed in a lime green waistcoat embroidered in scarlet thread and a turquoise coat, the young man had no doubt heard her censorious remarks to the squire and feared what she might say to him, such as the many ways that his money could be put to better use than turning himself out in such a ridiculous fashion. When Barrington had suggested that Esther seek out patrons from among the local gentry, he had envisioned her taking a slightly different, and much less disparaging, tack. Yet, he should have known that Esther would likely go charging in with her usual poorly received bluntness. She seemed to have a knack for making others feel defensive and uncomfortable by pointing out their failings and shortcomings for all to see. Her father sat several chairs down from her on the same side of the table. From that position, he couldn't view her over the bright purple turbaned head of the lady seated directly beside him. Not unless he leaned way out so as to see around the elderly matron. But from the older man's expression, Barrington had no doubt he could hear his daughter's every word. Unfortunately, the vicar was seated at too great a distance from Esther to silence her. Barrington wished he could have said something to dissuade Esther from voicing such contentious opinions before she'd pushed the two men so far that one had snubbed her and the other refused to acknowledge her. But any comment from Barrington, however well-meaning, would have led to an argument, doubtlessly. And that wouldn't have done anything to help her cause. Her gaze shifted to focus on him, and as she realized he'd been watching her, a flush spread across her skin. He offered her a bracing smile and saw her straighten her shoulders in response. However, when she tried to introduce a more neutral subject and draw either of them into a discussion about their plans for after the holiday, they rebuffed her efforts, ignoring her in favor of speaking to the ladies on their other side. She lapsed into silence as the meal progressed, an unusual occurrence for the normally opinionated and outspoken Esther Mullins. Frankly, Barrington didn't like to see her in such low spirits, no matter that they usually crossed words whenever she opened her mouth. He wanted to somehow offer her encouragement, but her eyes were downcast, focused on the plate in front of her as she applied herself to the roast pheasant with seeming single-minded purpose. She didn't raise her gaze to meet his again, though he silently willed it. "Don't you agree, Lord Barrington?" The lady on his left spoke, pulling him out of his private musings. He turned his attention toward the daughter of the Marquis of Dothford. "I apologize, Lady Elizabeth. I didn't quite hear your question. I said it's lovely weather we're having for this time of year, don't you think?" "I suppose so, if one is partial to the rain." "Oh, I am." She let out a high-pitched giggle that made him jump in his chair. "I adore listening to the rain falling outside as I sit cozily in front of a warm fire, setting stitches with my colored embroidery threads." His mother might consider this 17-year-old girl a suitable match for him, but she seemed so young to Barrington, having only made her come out the previous spring. He glanced over at Esther. She was just a few years older than Lady Elizabeth, but the two females seemed worlds apart in every other respect. He thought that he had caught a glint of moisture in Esther's eyes a few moments ago, tears perhaps. He wondered with no small amount of concern, but knowing Esther as he did, it had more likely been anger that he'd seen instead. After the dessert course had been cleared away, his mother stood from her seat at the foot of the table. "Ladies, let us retire to the music room and leave the men to their after-dinner port and cigars." Every man present stood as the women rose to their feet, and once the females had departed the room, the gentlemen resumed their seats. Barrington feared what Esther might encounter in the music room, if she took the same tack with any of the women as she had with Squire Quin. He doubted it would end well for any of those involved. Esther sat silently on a settee in the corner of Lord and Lady Rostendom's music room, where her mother had directed her when they'd entered the room. It seemed the older woman has overheard Esther's earlier comments and had forbidden her from speaking to any of the other women present for the remainder of the evening. Actually, her precise words had been, "You will speak with no one." Which was probably just as well. Esther's conversation at dinner hadn't gone at all as planned. She certainly had not gotten the desired results, just the opposite in fact. Now, she felt alone, relegated to the fringes of the gathering, though she was surrounded by more than a dozen others. Almost as alone as she had felt when Lewis had turned to face the lady on his left at the dinner table. Although Esther had kept her lashes lowered, she'd known the moment his attention had shifted elsewhere. It was as though all the warmth had gone out of the room. When the men joined them later, she was surprised that Lewis moved toward her and took a seat next to her, claiming the vacant space on the settee. She glanced at him in question, but he didn't say anything as his mother invited several young ladies to provide musical entertainment to the gathered guests. Lady Elizabeth Morville sat down on the bench in front of the pianoforte, and Catherine Quinn and another girl stood to the side, preparing to provide their voices in accompaniment. As the first notes of the traditional Christmas carol filled the room, Catherine let out a screech that not only made Esther wince, but it also drowned out the more pleasing tones of the second girl. Lewis leaned close to Esther, and her heart reacted to the movement, beating at a frenzied pace. His breath teased the loose curls at her temple as he spoke low in her ear. "I've never heard anything quite so awful." Her lips curved up in response. "Nor have I." He was silent for a few moments before he spoke again. "I could not help but overhear your exchange with Squire Quinn." Had everyone at the table been privy to her conversation? She wondered with some exasperation. Or had the gossip merely travelled that fast? It had been one of her lower moments, and for Lewis to have witnessed it, she felt mortified beyond belief. "Please, I would be ever so grateful if you would forget that unfortunate incident. I realized you were acting upon the suggestion I made to you the other day, and given that fact, I merely wished to point out that perhaps there is a better way to achieve your ends." "Are you offering your piles of money?" "Father has cut off my allowance, I'm afraid," he revealed. "The Earl expects an accounting of every pound I wish to spend while I take on the responsibilities as heir to the earldom, at last, and search for a suitable future countess." "Oh, how you must be suffering," she mocked. The others in the room clapped politely as the song finally came to an end, some rather more enthusiastic in their applause, doubtlessly in appreciation that their ears were no longer being assaulted. Then Mrs. Quinn encouraged her gifted daughter to sing another song, and Esther didn't believe she was mistaken in thinking that she wasn't the only one who groaned silently in response. Once the trio started into the next Christmas carol, Lewis picked up the thread of their previous conversation, ignoring Esther's last remark. "My point is that a different approach might be in order. I cannot hold my tongue when I see such indifference to the plight of others. I'm not suggesting that you should remain silent, rather that if you're less harsh in voicing your opinions, perhaps it might yield a better outcome. I'm certain it would make no difference. Surely, it wouldn't hurt to make an attempt." Exasperation had begun to creep into his tone. "Your unsolicited advice is duly noted, but though you are urging me to change my manner, you are not prepared to offer any monetary support. Words are easily spoken, Lord Barrington, but actions are the true measure of a man. And you yourself are unwilling to help." He shook his head in an immediate denial. "I'm not unwilling, simply unable." "So you say?" His eyes darkened in frustration. "Esther." "No, I do not wish to discuss this any further." Though her heart had filled with warmth at his use of her given name, she would not allow that to soften her attitude toward him. Lewis pushed abruptly to his feet. "I was trying to offer you some sound advice, but clearly I'm wasting my time. You're determined to listen to no one but yourself. So, I shall bid you farewell, Miss Mullins." With a curt bow, he took his leave of her and moved away to the far side of the room. He halted by the fireplace and propped his forearm against the mantelpiece, abandoning Esther to her lonely little corner once more. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Chapter 9. Barrington regretting losing his temper with Esther the previous night. He'd greatly disliked that he couldn't give her the answer she desired. Especially when she'd never asked for his support of her causes before. Though perhaps he should have made an offer of aid in all those months she'd searched for other means. He was shamed to admit he'd never considered using a portion of his allowance for charity. But why hadn't she turned to him for help rather than courting ruin by pursuing her disastrous scheme to sneak into a gentleman's club? They had been friends once. But no more? He couldn't accept that. He entered his father's study. Floor-to-ceiling walnut bookshelves lined two walls, with large French windows behind the desk and a fireplace on the opposite wall, flanked by a pair of hunter-green wingback chairs. Barrington stood before the Earl's large mahogany desk and cleared his throat. "Father, might I have a word with you?" The older man looked up from the ledger that was lying open on the desk. "Of course, Barrington. Come in and sit down." Once he'd done as bidden, his father continued. "What matter do you wish to speak to me about?" His palms grew clammy and he rubbed them on the fabric of his breeches. "I've come to request a release of my allowance." His father leaned back in his large wingback chair, looking much like a king on his throne granting one of his subjects an audience. "How much do you require?" Barrington gulped nervously before answering, feeling apprehensive of his father's reaction. "Several £100. Lord Rostendom's eyebrows pulled together above the bridge of his nose. "And for what purpose do you need such a large sum of money? Did you run up another bill at the tailor's or lose it on a game of cards?" In that moment, Barrington felt much as he had in his boyhood when he'd been called to account for some misdeed. But at 24, he was a man fully grown now. "No, father. I'd like to use the funds to aid Miss Mullen's causes. She's helped me realize how much good could be done with my monthly allowance. Though her methods may be misguided, her heart's in the right place." I see. Well, I will agree to your request." He held up a hand before Barrington could express his gratitude. "On one condition." "And that is?" "You will not disappear from Elmwood Hall again while we have guests in residence. I expect you to spend time in the company of the young ladies your mother has invited and determine which of them you might consider as your wife. You shall give due consideration to each of the prospective brides your mother had selected." Barrington hesitated for only an instant. "You have my word, father. With your permission, I would like to visit Miss Mullins to relay the good news to her, but I will return here post-haste and do as you ask." After he departed from his father's study, he exited the house and headed to the stables to have his horse saddled as the afternoon grew dark with an approaching storm. Though his heart felt heavy, acknowledging that Esther could never be his wife, at least he'd be able to aid her causes. Esther arranged the pair of mincemeat pies on the table set up at the front of the church. A group of 6 children had already arrived for the celebration her mother had planned. The older woman and cook would be bringing more food shortly. The feast, along with the warm woolen stockings Esther and her mother had stitched, would be given to the local villagers in honor of the Christmas season. The door of the church opened and Esther glanced up to see Lewis enter, a dusting of white covering his black curls and the shoulders of his navy coat. It started to snow. She rushed to look out the window, but it was impossible to see anything through the multicolored stained glass. She hoped the weather wouldn't discourage people from coming. Although, in that case, then she could focus all her efforts on finding a way to gain some much-needed support for her causes in London. She turned back toward Lewis and found him brushing the snowflakes from his clothing with one hand. "What are you doing here?" He held up the basket he carried in his other hand. "Your mother asked me to deliver this, since I was journeying this way." "You were coming here," she checked. "Why?" "There's a pressing matter I'd like to discuss with you." He moved forward to the front of the church and tucked the basket beneath the table. "What matter could we have that requires discussion?" she demanded. "I've obtained the funds to aid your London causes." "What? How?" "I asked my father for an advance on my allowance." "The allowance that he cut off?" "Yes. Once I presented him with a reasonable request detailing why I desired the sum, he gave his agreement. I advised you that a different approach would garner a better outcome, and I was right. I'm sure it had nothing to do with your elevated station or the fact that you're his son." She didn't try to mask her sarcastic tone. Members of the aristocracy simply did not understand the challenges of ordinary people. The nobility were granted privileges and advantages merely due to their birth and family name. She propped her fists on her hips. "The Earl of Rostendham would not have given the money to me, even had I begged." "I don't believe that's true." "My father is a fair man." And of course, you could never be mistaken in anything. Lewis finally seemed to pick up on her resentment. Well, as it's clear I'm not welcome here, I'll take my leave. And take his coins with him? Oh, why had she been so thoughtless as to anger him? Now he might decide against aiding her causes. Perhaps he had a point that her approach was badly flawed. Do you intend to withdraw your support? What? He shook his head. No, of course not. I'll not make others suffer merely because you and I are at odds. Father will send a bank draft to our London solicitor, and he'll see to it. Thank you. Think nothing of it. I must return home to Elmwood Hall now. Of course. And I shall continue with the preparations. But she didn't immediately return to her task, instead watching Lewis walk to the door of the church. He placed his hand on the knob, but the door remained shut tight. Pushing against the wood panel, he strained with all his might, but still the door refused to open. Finally, he abandoned the effort and turned back toward her. It appears that the door isn't functioning properly. I cannot think why it won't open. I hardly think the snow has piled up too high against the outer wall and is blocking the door so quickly. Perhaps the wood has swelled with the moisture of the snow. Privately, Esther didn't feel that he had tried any too hard to budge the door, but surprising herself, she didn't mention her observation. The others will be arriving soon. I'm certain they'll be able to pull the door open from the outside, and you shall soon be free of both me and the children, she said. Esther felt a slight tug on the hem of her sleeve. She looked down to see a small girl of about 7 standing at her side, clenching her younger sister's hand. Yes, Francis. Eloise and me is hungry, Miss Mullins. Can we have a small bite of pie? Lewis took note of the 2 mincemeat pies sitting on the table. Let us feed the children while we wait for rescue. Esther nearly giggled at his use of the word rescue, hardly thinking that such a drastic term was the case. In truth, she remained hopeful that Lewis might be looking for any excuse to remain in her company, and the thought pleased her immensely. Once the food was consumed, Esther sat down on one of the pews, wrapping her arms around herself as she shivered in the cold air. Lewis sat down beside her, much nearer than was proper, but Esther wasn't about to voice any protests as warmth from his large frame seeped into her chilled flesh. It doesn't seem that rescue is coming tonight, Lewis commented. The snow must be keeping many others in their homes, trapping them the same as you and I. Esther frowned. Was it possible that he hadn't been conjuring up an excuse to stay with her after all? She rose and went to the door herself, pushing against it with all her might. As Lewis had said, it was indeed stuck. She tried again, but it wouldn't budge. She peered through a small side window, and even in the near darkness, she saw that the snow had increased alarmingly. Is this where I'm supposed to admit that you're right? She asked with a slight smile. However they had ended up together that evening, she wasn't going to protest. Perish the thought, Lewis responded. Her grin widened in response. Chapter 10. The children chatted amongst themselves, seeing the evening as a great adventure. Lewis marveled at the way Esther occupied them with the bits of paper and pine cones and tree boughs meant to be decorations. They now happily played on the first 2 pews. He and Esther watched them from nearer the back of the church, where they stood side by side. Esther's full pink lips were a temptation too much, and Barrington couldn't resist leaning forward to press his mouth to hers. She stilled in surprise for a handful of frozen seconds, but then she responded to his kiss. Pleasure coursed through his body, and he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer. I'm cold, a young boy's voice interrupted their stolen embrace. Barrington pulled away from Esther immediately. Her cheeks were flushed and she was clearly embarrassed, her lips stained the color of ripe berries from the odor of their kiss. He quickly moved to the wicker basket Mrs. Mullins had asked him to deliver to the church. I think I have just the thing to remedy that. When he'd inquired as to the basket's contents, Mrs. Mullins had surprised him by revealing that it was filled with the woolen stockings she and Esther had stitched over the past week. Now opening the lid, he retrieved a small pair that looked to be about the right size. He gestured the young boy to come closer and sit down, so Barrington could slip off his worn shoes and pull the warm wool over his feet before replacing the footwear. The young boy grinned and wiggled his toes as Barrington shifted back to rest on his haunches. The next child moved forward, and Barrington repeated the process. In short order, he had placed new, warm stockings on all the children. As the hour grew late, the half-dozen children curled up to sleep, snuggled together like a litter of puppies. He and Esther sat on opposite sides of the huddled mass of protruding arms and legs. "I'm quite perplexed," Esther murmured. "Why is that? Why haven't the parents of these children come to collect them? Is the snow really so treacherous? Would they not be worried?" Barrington considered this. "It is likely they haven't ventured out because they have so much faith in your mother and in you. They know the children are safe. I believe it is a tribute to you and your family and the work you do here." Willa's brow crinkled into a frown. "I hadn't thought of it like that." In the silence that fell over the church, Willa looked so attractive, so pure and so noble that Barrington's heart ached. Then he remembered that his parents were at that very moment hosting a houseful of suitable young ladies he had promised to consider for his wife. Yet here he had been kissing Esther instead. He felt quite torn between duty and desire. The expectations of the earldom weighed heavily against the love he felt for this fascinating woman. It warmed Esther's heart to see Lewis's interactions with the children, witnessing his compassion and tenderness toward them. And his kiss had left other parts of her person overly warm. The touch of his lips against hers had sent a shock of pleasure through her. She knew he couldn't marry her, and given that fact, how could his intentions toward her be honorable? But she refused to believe he was the kind of man who would take such shameful advantage, no matter that he was a member of the detestable ton. Lewis must have feelings for her, as she had for him. But depression crept through her as she realized that nothing could ever come of an attachment between them. The thought lowered her spirits considerably, and thus she pushed it from her mind. As her gaze swept over the children, she noticed the thinness of their limbs and the threadbare state of their clothing, coats with more patches than fabric and shoes with holes. How had she never realized the tremendous lack that was right in front of her? With her attention focused on the suffering in London, she had failed to recognize that the needs in the country were just as great. Moreover, she had failed to see the value in her mother's charitable acts. She felt ashamed that she had begrudged the time spent lending her assistance to stitch the stockings, which these children now wore. But no more. While Esther remained determined not to neglect her work in London, neither would she turn her back on the people in this village who were also in need of her aid. She spoke quietly so as to not awaken the sleeping children, but she knew Lewis would hear her words. "I allowed myself to be blind to the needs of those less fortunate in places other than London, and I have blinded myself to all the good work my mother has done here in Rostendam." His voice floated back to her in the dim light given off by a single lantern. "As I've taken on more of the responsibilities as my father's heir, I've seen how truly dependent our tenants are on our goodwill. Elmwood's tenants are well provided for, but many of the other families living in the district aren't so fortunate." They fell silent once more as the wind howled outside, causing bare tree branches to scratch against the stained glass windows. Esther shivered in reaction and shifted closer to the nearest child. With her newfound purpose to help even more people, she must find a source of additional funds. Lewis's promised benevolence would only stretch so far. However, Lewis had presented a valid point at the dinner party the other night. While changing her approach might garner more disparagement directed at her, it wouldn't adversely affect her causes, since no one seemed willing to give their support as matters stood. Her current method certainly wasn't working to achieve her desired aim. She must carry on. She must continue to petition others. She might continue to hear refusals, but that wouldn't be any different than the current situation. And if there was a chance she could successfully appeal to others' better nature, instead of focusing on their shortcomings, then it was worth making the effort, at least. If she always did this thing the same way, how could she expect anything other than to always receive the same results? She had to willingly set aside her pride for the sake of the people she hoped to help. And it had been pride alone that had kept her from acknowledging the wisdom of Lewis's words and accepting his advice before now. A loud scraping sound woke Esther from slumber, and she opened her eyes to see Lewis standing at the open door of the church, a rainbow of bright colors dancing around him from the sunlight shining through the stained glass windows. The parents had arrived, and their children were already gathering happily around them, greeted by great hugs and kisses. "The door," she exclaimed. "It's open." Lewis smiled at her. "It is as you said. Once the parents pulled on the door from outside while I pushed from the inside, it opened quite readily. The parents spoke over one another, expressing their thanks for their children's safekeeping. They departed amidst lots of chatter and exclamations from their young ones. Esther watched them go, her heart overflowing with gratitude. They were wonderful people, and she felt humbled and honored to be able to serve them. Lewis gave her a long look, his eyes full of appreciation and tenderness. Now that the children have headed home, we should do the same. I am certain your parents are worried, and your father will likely be arriving any moment. He raised her hand to his lips and placed a kiss on the back of it before releasing her. His touch sent a wealth of emotions rushing through her. He looked as though he intended to say something more, but with a shake of his head, he pressed his lips together. She smiled at him, and then he spoke. I'll escort you to the vicarage before I return to Elmwood Hall. The sun sparkled like diamonds on the layer of white covering the ground. Esther's half-boots crunched on the hardened snow as they left the church, and the cold air numbed her cheeks. Across the road, a spotted terrier barked as it chased a pair of young boys amid high-pitched yipping and squeals of laughter. Esther and Lewis traveled in silence until they arrived at her home. He bowed over her hand. Good day to you, Miss Mullins. And you, as well, Lord Barrington, she replied, though she hated the stiff formality that had sprung up between them so quickly after they had shared so much the previous night. But perhaps that had only existed in her mind. Still, she mourned the loss of closeness as she watched him walk away. Chapter 11. I'll be paying a call on Lady Rostendham. Esther's mother informed her later that day. While I'm gone, perhaps you might. I'd like to join you on your call to Elmwood Hall, if you'll permit. The older woman gave a curt nod. I trust that you won't say anything to offend our hostess or her guests. I promise your faith in me is not misplaced, Esther replied. Well, run along and collect your gloves and cape, then. A short time later, Esther trailed along behind her mother as they entered the formal parlor at Elmwood Hall. The room was done in shades of green and gold with watered silk fabric on the walls. Holly and strings of cranberries were draped above the mantel and mistletoe hung over the doorway. Esther's mother greeted the Countess of Rostendham, and Esther followed suit, bobbing a curtsy to the older woman. Lady Rostendham, I hope you are well. Quite well, thank you, Miss Mullins. After greeting the other ladies present, including the Quinns, Esther took a seat, perching on the edge of a settee with her mother at her side. She accepted a china cup from Lady Rostendham, then busied herself sipping the tea and holding her silence, allowing the others to direct the flow of the conversation until such time as an appropriate opening presented itself. Her mother was the one to provide it. It was unfortunate that the storm ruined the festivities at the church. But we shan't allow that to dampen our spirits, for the vicar has agreed that we shall hold our Christmas celebration after a special Christmas Eve service instead. At that time, we shall present the villagers with food and warm clothing as planned. Esther lowered her cup to the saucer. I have recently learned that it was you, Lady Rostendham, who provided the wool for the stockings. The Countess nodded in acknowledgement to Esther's words. I greatly admire your benevolence to the local villagers, my lady. Esther took a deep breath and forged ahead. I would be ever so grateful for your help in assisting the less fortunate in London as well. Esther heard her mother gasp, but the Countess considered Esther in silence for a long moment before speaking. And where do you believe the need is greatest? Oh, she trailed off, taken by surprise by the Countess's willingness to discuss the issue. In light of past incidents, Esther had reached the conclusion that all anyone else wished to speak of was anything other than that which Esther desired. She hastily gathered her wits. The lack of the most basic necessities, food and shelter. The orphan children in the poorest areas, especially, suffer greatly. I would be honored to aid such a worthy cause, Lady Rostendham replied. I shall pledge my aid as well, Mrs. Quinn interjected. I'll speak to the squire at once, and my relations, the Duke and Duchess of Haviland, as well. Thank you, Mrs. Quinn, Esther responded in astonishment. Your generosity does you great credit, the Countess of Rostendham remarked. Mrs. Quinn preened in pleasure at the compliment, though Esther suspected the older woman had promised her help solely to impress the Countess, rather than due to any true desire to give aid to the less fortunate. But Esther wasn't going to turn down her offer simply because the other woman might not have the purest of motives. Several other ladies chimed in as well, following the Countess's lead. Esther felt overjoyed to have gained Lady Rostendham's support. and the support of the others, no matter their reasons. Lewis had been correct all along. She didn't know why she was surprised. Clearly, she should have listened to him sooner. So Lewis wasn't the self-important man she'd imagined. She had been guilty of judging him on the basis of others, not letting herself see his true character, because then she risked growing to care for him. And she knew a marriage between them could never be. But for all she'd fought against it, she loved him. Barrington lingered just outside the sitting room door, cheered by Esther's rousing success. A short time later that afternoon found Barrington in the exact same place he had occupied just the day previous. He stood before the desk in his father's study, his feet braced apart and his hands clasped at his back. He straightened his spine and cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, Father, but I cannot marry any of the unattached young ladies at our Christmas house party." "Oh." An impervious mask covered the Earl's features. "I thought we had an agreement that you would give serious consideration to finding a wife. I have found the woman I hope to make my wife, but she isn't one of the young ladies Mother has deemed suitable." "Who is this girl, then?" "Vicar Mullen's daughter, Esther." The older man's eyebrows shot up, and then he rubbed his chin, his fingers scrapping against the bristles covering his skin. "I love her, Father," Barrington declared. Lewis had loved her when he'd spoken to his father before, though he hadn't admitted it even to himself for a long while. He had known his family would not consider her a suitable choice for his wife. He believed he could never marry her, that society would never accept their union. But others' opinions mattered not anymore. He refused to listen to the gossip of small-minded people, and he wouldn't allow it to determine his life's course. His happiness was not predicated on the approval of the ton. Others might not view Esther as his equal, but in his eyes, and in his heart, she was more than worthy. Her generous spirit in helping those in need and her desire to change things for the betterment of those less fortunate set her above many who outranked her in name alone. "I have no wish to go against you," Barrington continued when his father remained silent. "But I am hoping you will give me your consent so that I may ask for her hand in marriage." He tapped his foot nervously as he awaited his father's response. The Earl took his time mulling over everything before he answered. "She's not who we hoped for." "Yes, Father, I know that. But she is the one I love. I fear your mother will be gravely disappointed." Barrington squared his shoulders. "Not when she gets to know Esther." His voice grew passionate. "Esther could never disappoint anyone." The Earl's brow rose again, and for a moment, Barrington feared he would burst into laughter. "I'm dead serious, Father. Esther is a wonderful person." Again, the Earl was silent. He studied his son for a long moment. "I see. She is my choice, Father. She is the only woman for me." The Earl shook his head, and now he did chuckle quietly. "What I'm about to say will likely shock you. But son, as strange as it seems, you do have my blessing. However, I don't think you truly required it. I suspect it wouldn't change the outcome, even had I refused to grant it. I know you, and I know that look of determination on your face." Barrington let out his breath. "You are correct, Father. Esther and I will be married, if she'll have me. But I don't wish to be at odds with you. I don't want discord between us, and I hope you and Mother will welcome Esther into the family as my wife. She will need guidance in the duties and responsibilities of a future countess and lady of a grand estate." His father sighed. "There is no mistake about that. She will need guidance, and she shall have it. That girl certainly gave Squire Quinn a full dosage of ire at our recent dinner party. That will not do in the future, even though I myself sometimes consider the Squire quite the dolt. Oddly, your mother and I both admire Miss Mullins. I believe she's been a good influence on you, and she shall continue to steer you in the right direction in considering the needs of others. It will serve you well when you become Earl of Rostendham. As you have come to learn, one's tenants are not merely here to provide the nobility with an income. We have a responsibility to them to provide for their welfare in return." The Earl lowered his gaze to the papers spread out in front of him on his desk. A few seconds ticked past before he glanced up again. "Well, what are you doing still standing here? I'll expect news of an engagement shortly." Lewis's heart jolted with excitement. "I must convince Miss Mullins to say yes first." "Well?" Off you go, then. And I shall deal with your mother. The Earl shooed Barrington along with a wave of his hand. Barrington left the older man muttering about discussing plans with the Countess to turn their Christmas ball into an engagement ball and making a formal announcement. Frankly, Barrington was surprised, albeit exceedingly pleased, by the ease of his father's acceptance. At the stables, he took his horse's reins from the groom. Pulling himself up into the saddle, he rode out of the stable yard and across the rolling hills and barren fields. When he reached the vicarage, he approached Esther's father first. "I've come to formally request your daughter's hand in marriage," Barrington stated his intentions. After a short interview, he received the vicar's somewhat surprised blessing and sought out Esther. He found her bundled up and seated on a stone bench beyond the bare limbs of a tree in the snow-covered garden behind the stone cottage. A fur lap rug was tucked around her, protecting her from the chill in the air. She wore a muted pink wool gown with scarlet flowers stitched along the collar and cuffs, and rose-colored ribbons threaded through her blonde curls. The cold had brought forth a bloom of pink in her cheeks, to match the shade of her gown, and caused her blue-green eyes to stand out in startling contrast. Her eye sparkled with warmth when she saw him, giving him hope that she might return his affection. "May I join you, Miss Mullins? You certainly are outside on a cold day. I enjoy the beauty of nature. Although I will admit that I am a bit cold. And yes, of course, Lord Barrington, you must join me." She shifted on the bench to make a space for him. "I didn't expect to see you today. There's not an issue with the funds, is there?" He shook his head as he sat down beside her and reached for her hands, taking them in his. "Miss Mullins, Esther," he stopped short, struggling to find the right words. He hadn't expected this to be so difficult. He'd not allowed himself to consider what he would do if she rejected him. What if she didn't feel for him as he did for her? Barrington had no desire for a wife who married him solely for his title and fortune. Not that he had any fears of Esther desiring such an arrangement. Rather he worried that she would refuse him because of his elevated station. At that thought, his palms began to sweat inside his gloves. Well, he would know soon enough. Gathering his courage, he pressed forward. "Esther, will you consent to be my wife?" Esther's mouth fell open in startled surprise. "How?" She shook her head and started again. "I am not Countess material. I fear I will never be a proper lady. I beg to differ. I believe you'll make an exceptional Countess." She bit down on her full lower lip. "I will not give up my causes. Nor would I ever ask it of you," he assured her. "I love you, Esther." Her lips parted as a soft gasp slipped out. "Truly?" He leaned forward and pressed his mouth to hers in a tender kiss. "Yes, truly." A smile wreathed her face and tears shimmered in her blue-green eyes, their color like the sea after a storm. "I love you, too, Louis." His heart seemed to take flight at her words. And he found he liked the sound of his given name on her tongue. Suddenly, her bright expression dimmed. "I want to marry you, but what about Lord and Lady Rostendham? I couldn't bear it if you became estranged from your family and I were the cause. No need to fear on that account. My father supports our union." Apparently, that was all she needed to hear. "Then I will be your wife, Louis, my love. I would like nothing more. And you shall become a member of the despised social set known as the aristocracy." He smiled as her features screwed up in displeasure. "I intend to be a most unconventional future countess," she warned him. He didn't wish for her to be any other way, nor for her to change a single thing about herself. Still, he couldn't resist teasing her. "But think of all the good you could do as the Countess of Rostendham if you don't thumb your nose at the rules of the ton." She opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, he silenced her with another kiss. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Grace Austen. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Grace Austen, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Grace Austen romance.